What is the boldest thing you've seen someone do to greatly lower their cost of living? Before we start with the first story, please hit subscribe and ring the notification bell to stay updated with us. Story 1. My best friend divorced his spendaholic wife who had gotten them into over $50,000 of credit card debt and wanted to take out a second mortgage on the house to buy herself another car. He ended up with half the debt, of course, but he moved in with his sister and dug himself out after 4 years. He lives alone now and is the most careful person with money I've ever seen. She's being supported by her parents who have her on a strict budget. She's almost 50 now. I shudder to think what will happen when they pass and she inherits. Story 2. Don't think he did it to lower his cost of living, but a guy I worked with was sleeping in the woods behind the place we worked at. No tent, just a sleeping bag and a tarp. He would sneak into the building really early and use the showers in the mornings he worked. Don't know why he didn't sleep in his car in the parking lot. We later found out the guy had an untreated mental illness. He was paranoid about the banks, would cash his entire check and hide any unspent money in his underwear, socks, and shoes, and that he was going to be locked into his apartment and imprisoned forever. Story 3. Knew a woman who was A, not too bright, and B, is troubled by mental illness. She called me, paranoid about a cigarette butt that she dropped in the toilet, and was worried it would flare up. Rationality comes in second to paranoia, if it comes at all. Years before that, the assistant manager at my job, and a bit of a friend, lapsed, I think partly due to drugs. He had come west to find prosperity, but after a year or so, lost his apartment, moved into a motel, then ended up in a tent in our younger, still teenage friend's backyard. Young friend's dad finally had enough and evicted him. By then, I had mostly lost contact, and he'd alienated everyone. At some point in his motel period, his personal grooming and job stopped. He spent some time living in the woods, either between the motel and backyard, or after the backyard. Somehow he got in contact with his family in Nova Scotia, and they sent money to get him home. I was the last to see him. I gave him a ride to the bus stop. He stank of BO and unwashed, camp smoke-filled clothing. Hopefully he made it home and found a better path with support from his family, but that's a long 5,000 kilometers trip, 3,200 miles, if you are American. Story 4. My older sister had my niece at 18. She used me as daycare for the entirety of her college education. I babysat 8-10 hours a day for my sister because she promised when she got her first job, she'd split her first paycheck with me. I was in high school at the time and didn't have a third or fourth period, so I'd watch my niece from around noon till my sister got home. Unfortunately, when I brought up our agreement, she went like Jerry Springer crazy on me and called me everything from entitled to selfish. But hey, she got a good 3 years of free child care from me, and now she's living with an abusive alcoholic, so I can't let her babysit my kids. Story 5. Honestly, probably selling their gorgeous 5-bedroom house to downsize when they absolutely didn't need to. They were doing fine financially, but they basically eliminated having a mortgage by purchasing a smaller home outright with the equity they gained from their first home. It was a pretty baller move, in my opinion, considering most people are always looking to upgrade. Now they have no debt and are the only people I know with fairly standard jobs that aren't currently struggling. Part of the reasoning could have also just been practicality rather than finance maybe. Personally, I wouldn't want a house bigger than what I needed, so at most I'm guessing I'll only ever have a 2-bed, 1-bath place. I'd like a little courtyard or balcony, but nothing huge. Who knows though? Life might surprise me. I just don't see the point in getting anything bigger, more maintenance, more cleaning, more gardening. It just feels like so much extra work if you don't actually need that space. I'm lazy though, haha. Story 6. It's worth noting that typically the change in pay equals out to making as much or less than you would in California. If you have a college degree, you're often doing better in California, or at least Louisiana, where I live, than you would in, say, the Midwest. Sure, it's way cheaper to live in the middle of nowhere, but they also don't pay you nearly as much, and there are a lot of added expenses that people don't consider. Everything is more time-intensive. For one thing, a lot of the cheapest US cities to live in are also dangerous for the queer community and people of color, and have the lowest average age of death. You can move to Tulsa, but it's not a place to put down roots if you're, well, smart. The whole dying early thing, not great. A lot of poor people are told to move somewhere cheaper, but it ultimately isn't a fix for systemic issues. It might not even improve your life at all. California is more expensive and my partner and I live with his parents, but nobody has harassed or assaulted me, threatened my life, etc. about being gay since I moved here from a rural part of Pennsylvania, and it's way better to have a support system than not. Story 7. I can't say I've seen anyone do anything voluntarily. Living out of a car, semi-permanent resident at a campsite, these aren't things you do when things are going well for you. I like the van life idea, but you have to live in the right part of the country because you don't have cheap control of temp. Many of the cheap routes require a comfortable environment first, or it really starts to suck fast. You can certainly make do, but you're making real-life choices at that point. It also helps if the job allows it. Are you in a region, or are your travel and work sites conducive for such living? Or are you just sitting in Walmart parking lots all your life? There's very fitting situations. Story 8. This was something I actually did. For a while, I rented an apartment that was being managed by a very incompetent real estate agency. Not only were they incompetent, but also shady as hell. By pure chance, I met someone who previously lived in my apartment and was cheated out of their 3-month deposit. They tried to sue the apartment owner, but never managed as he lived abroad and was shielded by the shady real estate company. I was nervous to be screwed like they were once I had to leave the apartment. Luckily for me, the owner decided to sell it, and, being the epitome of incompetence, the agency couldn't find my rental contract anywhere to pass on to the new owner. They asked me directly how much rent I was paying, and if I could change my rental payments from the old owner's bank account to the new one. Being presented with a golden opportunity, I took the risk and claimed my rent was 200% lower than it used to be, and promptly paid it to the new owner. No one said anything, and I kept paying on time at a discount for some 5 or 6 months. After that period, they started complaining that my rent was too low, and ended up requesting an increase of an insane $500, $300 more than I was originally paying. I got a lawyer to write them a letter explaining all the ways that increase was illegal and kept paying at my discounted price. They didn't try to fight back, but were not happy. Since my contract was at risk of not being renovated, I graciously allowed them a 100% increase, which I guess was enough of a victory for the agency. It stayed like this for a couple more years, and I'm still amazed it worked. Story 9. A bit outdated now that newspapers aren't really a thing anymore. But I knew a guy in Los Angeles who would read the papers for delinquent property tax notices. He'd find a property that was empty and in a nice place in the Hollywood Hills. He'd keep an eye on it for a week or so to make sure it's really empty. Then he'd just move in. He'd clean the place up, hire gardeners to keep the bushes trimmed and the grass cut, and since he wasn't paying rent, he could afford to have repairs done. He even had the carpet replaced in one place. Eventually, the owner or property manager or a real estate person would show up, usually months or even years later, and call the cops on him. But he'd have a fake lease in hand, plus a stack of handwritten receipts for the cash rent he'd been paying monthly to the guy who rented it to me. He'd be very apologetic and understanding, and because he had proof that he was a tenant, it took at least 90 days to evict him. During that 90 days, he'd watch the papers for delinquent tax notices. He kept it up for like 10 years, until the real estate market got so hot that there simply weren't any empty places anymore. But he probably saved like $250,000 in rental expenses during that time. And really, he left those houses better than he found them. Story 10. I sold my beautiful home in a nice area in Texas and paid cash on a 60-year-old house in the Midwest. I have 4 kids. 2 are starting college next year. Thankfully, they have it covered in scholarships, but looking at the housing market, they may need a place to live for a bit. This house has a basement apartment and plenty of room. Paying cash on this house reduced my $2,300 a month mortgage to 0. It reduced my property tax from $15,000 a year. Don't be fooled by Texas no income tax they get you on the property tax, down to $2,500 a year. My electric bills for air conditioning in a 3,600 SQ foot house in Texas were over $600 a month. Now my bill for the same size home is about $80. My heat bills during a winter with negative temps maxed out at $300 a month in the coldest month. We've arranged our lives so we can fully live on one income and bank the other for retirement and our kids' futures. The house isn't the showstopper we had in Texas. It's nice, but needs updating. Oh well, my bank account looks a lot better. Story 11. When my sister was a student, she would go around the local bakeries and supermarkets just before closing and ask if they had any food they were throwing out. The freshly made in-store baked goods have a short shelf life, and whatever isn't sold by the end of the day is thrown out. The staff were always happy to throw it her way instead of into the bin out back. She would get clean garbage bags filled with food and take it back to her shared accommodation. Story 12. I stopped going out to eat, stopped getting coffee to go, stopped going to movies and bars. Instead, I put that money into a non-locked, high-risk TFSA and use it for emergencies or traveling. I do lots of all-inclusives with flight packages and watch for the deals. Typically spend around 2,300 Canadian dollars for a week with a direct flight out of my city. It has been a life changer for me. I learned to cook a larger variety of meals. It's helped with my weight loss. I've gotten to revisit countries I went to long ago and go to a couple of new ones. Even splurged and did a non-all-inclusive to a place I always had wanted to go to see an artist I have loved since I was a little girl in the 70s. I figure a couple of more trips and I will stop for a bit and just see what comes up that I may be interested in. The freedom to explore my interests has really improved my quality of life. Story 13. So, not necessarily to lower their cost of living, more to improve their lifestyle. I knew a young woman who had been with the same man for years. They had 2 kids. They were both teen parents, but they were still an item into adulthood, and they wanted to get married. But with them being low income if they got married, they wouldn't qualify for certain benefits. So, the dad lived in a studio apartment a few neighborhoods away. He would wake up early so he could be at her place before the kids woke up and get them to school. He would put them to bed at night before going back to his apartment. This way, both he and his partner could qualify for certain scholarships to go to community college. They were both in school. They had a 4-year plan that involved each of them getting a business after finishing their 2-year degrees. The scholarship she received was only for single individuals, so since he had a separate apartment that he slept at, so she qualified. This way, they could both work and go to school. It was an extreme choice, but respectable in my opinion. They were just working towards providing a better future for themselves and their kids, and they recognized that an extreme approach would get them there faster. I haven't spoken to them in years. I hope they're winning. They certainly work for it. Story 14. Used to work in the CPG industry, grocery stores. We did digital imaging and data scraping for e-commerce. It was cheaper for companies to send case packs than individual items, usually meaning we'd get cases of everything and anything you see in a grocery store. I didn't buy toilet paper for 8 years. Still have trash bags I got for free. Haven't worked there in over 3 years. I'm talking about scallops, turkeys, soap, and deodorant. My greatest haul was a $500 bottle of scotch. The job paid decently, but the free was insane. Story 15. Smartest I saw was a manager of an apartment building I lived in. Had worked several decades in tech and gotten some sort of settlement. I assume had like $1 million in net assets, maybe less. One day, while getting high, he explained he managed the building, got free rent, a small stipend, like $500 more or something. Building was all central utilities, so he only paid for cable internet. Worked a few gigs as a musician around town, but other than that, lived off his investments. I met him mid-50s. He lived to be about 70 before passing. This is the answer if you ever get a large settlement. 1 mil at 3-5% is approximately $30 minus 50 KYR in income. If you don't pay for housing, then that is totally doable, especially if you are willing to take some side gigs. Only thing to watch out for is health costs in the US, but even $300 minus 500 TEMO is doable with above budget. His biggest expenditures were weed and buying instruments as far as I could tell. That's a wrap. If you like more of this, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. You can also share your thoughts in the comment below. I'll see you in the next video.